The moment I heard my mother lean toward my father and whisper, "Have your son changed the locks at her apartment?" my entire birthday dinner stopped feeling like a celebration. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 34 years old. I kept my smile on my face, but inside, every alarm bell was ringing. Those 9 quiet words changed the meaning of everything that had happened that evening. We were sitting at my parents' favorite family restaurant just outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't fancy, but we'd celebrated birthdays there for years. A chocolate cake waited on a side table, balloons floated near our booth, and a few relatives chatted happily about work, vacations, and weekend plans. On the surface, everything looked completely normal. If someone had walked past our table, they would have seen a family enjoying another birthday together. I had almost believed that myself. The last 2 years had been difficult after my divorce. It hadn't been dramatic or ugly, but rebuilding my life afterward took more strength than anyone realized. My parents had been involved in nearly every decision I made, always insisting they were only trying to help. Sometimes their advice felt comforting. Other times, it felt like they still saw me as the frightened 20-year-old who needed permission to make her own choices. That evening, they had been unusually cheerful. Mom kept asking whether I was eating enough. Dad joked that I worked too much. My younger brother Liam laughed at old family stories while everyone passed appetizers around the table. Nothing felt suspicious. Until that whisper. It happened so quickly that I almost questioned whether I had heard it correctly. Mom leaned closer to Dad. Her voice was barely above a breath. "Have your son changed the locks at her apartment?" Dad gave the smallest nod. "I'll talk to Liam after dinner." Neither of them realized I was reaching for my water glass at exactly that moment. I heard every word. I froze for half a second before forcing myself to keep moving naturally. I lifted the glass, took a sip, smiled politely. No one noticed the sudden change in my expression. Inside, my thoughts raced. Change the locks? Why? On my apartment? What were they planning? I looked across the table at Liam. He was laughing at something one of our cousins had said, completely unaware that my parents had just volunteered him for something that made no sense. I studied my mother's face. She looked completely relaxed, almost satisfied. Dad casually picked up his menu again as though nothing unusual had happened. The conversation around the table continued without interruption. Someone asked what I wanted for dessert. Another relative suggested taking a group photo. I answered automatically, barely hearing my own voice. Every part of me was focused on the whispered conversation I couldn't stop replaying. My apartment wasn't just where I lived. It was the first place that truly felt like my own after my marriage ended. Every piece of furniture, every paint color, every quiet evening spent rebuilding my confidence. That apartment represented a fresh start. The thought of someone changing the locks without my permission made my stomach tighten. I wanted to ask my parents what they meant. I wanted to confront them right there in the restaurant, but something told me not to. If they were planning something behind my back, confronting them too early would only give them time to hide it. So I smiled when the birthday cake arrived. I thanked everyone for coming. I accepted hugs. I even laughed when Liam joked about me getting older. All the while, I quietly watched my parents. Neither of them suspected I had overheard their conversation. Neither of them knew they were talking about an apartment I legally owned through a company they had never heard of. The drive home after my birthday dinner felt much longer than usual. I turned the radio off and replayed my mother's whisper over and over in my mind. "Have your son changed the locks at her apartment?" The words refused to leave me alone. I kept wondering whether I had misunderstood, but deep down I knew exactly what I had heard. My parents had always been protective, yet this felt completely different. It felt planned. 2 years earlier, my divorce had turned my world upside down. My ex-husband and I ended things peacefully, but starting over wasn't easy. I had to rebuild my finances, my confidence, and my daily routine one careful step at a time. Everyone around me saw the divorce as the biggest chapter of my life, but to me, it became the beginning of discovering who I really was. During those first difficult months, my parents insisted on helping with everything. "You shouldn't be alone right now," Mom would say. "Dad and I are only looking out for you." At first I appreciated it. They helped me pack. They brought groceries. They checked in almost every day. Their support felt comforting while everything else in my life seemed uncertain. But slowly, their kindness became something else. Mom started questioning every decision I made. Dad wanted updates whenever I left town for work. If I didn't answer my phone immediately, they assumed something was wrong. What they called concern often felt like constant supervision. When I found the apartment where I eventually moved, my parents immediately approved. "It's small," Dad said, "but it's safe." Mom smiled. "And it's close enough that we can help if you need anything." I simply nodded. I never corrected them. I let them believe I was renting the apartment, because that version of the story kept unnecessary questions away from something I had worked years to accomplish. Long before my marriage ended, I had quietly developed a habit of saving every extra dollar I earned. Bonuses went into investments. Raises increased my savings instead of my spending. I skipped expensive vacations, delayed buying a newer car, and lived well below my income. No one noticed because I never talked about money. After my divorce, those years of careful planning finally gave me an opportunity. Instead of renting, I purchased the apartment building through a limited liability company that my attorney helped establish. Keeping my name off the public paperwork protected my privacy and made future investments easier. Very few people knew the truth. My attorney knew, my accountant knew, and I knew. That was enough. My parents believed every monthly payment I made was rent. Whenever Mom asked whether my landlord had fixed something, I simply smiled. "Everything's taken care of." That answer was always true. I just happened to be approving most of the maintenance decisions myself. The arrangement gave me something I hadn't felt in years: independence. I wasn't hiding my success to impress anyone later. I simply wanted one part of my life that belonged entirely to me. No opinions, no constant advice, no permission. Looking back, I realize my parents confused information with involvement. Because they didn't know every detail of my life, they assumed I needed their guidance more than ever. They never imagined I had quietly built enough stability to stand completely on my own. As I unlocked my apartment door that night, I paused for a moment inside the hallway. Everything around me represented years of discipline and quiet determination. The framed photos, the comfortable furniture, the freshly painted walls. Every corner reminded me that this wasn't just an apartment. It was something I had earned. I looked around the living room and suddenly understood why my mother's whispered plan unsettled me so deeply. She believed the apartment belonged to my ex-husband because he had once helped me find it. Her whispered plan was simple: have my younger brother Liam replace the locks while I was at work so I'd be forced to move back into my parents' house. They thought control looked like love, but they had no idea whose property it really was. The next morning, I woke up hoping the conversation from my birthday dinner had been some strange misunderstanding. I made coffee, stood by the kitchen window, and tried convincing myself that my parents would never actually interfere with my home. But the uneasy feeling never left. The more I thought about my mother's whisper, the more it sounded like a decision that had already been made, instead of an idea they were still discussing. As I got ready for work, I looked around my apartment with fresh eyes. Every room reflected the life I had slowly rebuilt after my divorce. The bookshelf I assembled by myself, the paintings I had chosen, the little herb garden growing beside the balcony window, all of it reminded me that this place represented independence, not just an address. My parents had visited several times over the past year. Mom often walked through the apartment commenting on where furniture should go. Dad usually checked the locks, windows, and smoke detectors before leaving. "I just want to make sure you're safe," he'd always say. At the time, I believed him. Now those visits felt different. I began wondering how long they had been discussing plans behind my back. One memory suddenly returned to me. A few weeks earlier, Mom had casually asked what time I usually left for work. "I guess around 8, I had answered. She smiled. "And you're home by 6? I hadn't thought much about the questions then. Now they sounded less like conversation and more like planning. Another memory followed. Dad had once asked whether my landlord ever changed the locks between tenants. "I suppose so," I replied. He nodded thoughtfully before changing the subject. At the time, the question seemed random. Now it didn't. The hardest part wasn't the possibility that they wanted access to my apartment. It was realizing they truly believed they had the right to make decisions about my life without asking me. They weren't trying to steal from me. They believed they were rescuing me. That made everything even more complicated. Control wrapped in concern can be difficult to recognize until someone crosses a line. By lunchtime, I had stopped wondering whether they meant what they said. Instead, I started asking myself what they actually believed. Then it hit me. My parents still thought my ex-husband had found the apartment and arranged everything after our divorce. They assumed I was only staying there because it was convenient. Mom had even said once, "At least he helped you find somewhere decent before everything ended." I never corrected her. There had never seemed to be a reason. The apartment search had only been a tiny part of the story. Yes, my ex-husband had mentioned the neighborhood because he knew I liked it. But that was where his involvement ended. He never negotiated the purchase. He never signed paperwork. He never contributed $1. Everything after that happened quietly through my attorney and my business records. The ownership stayed under my LLC from the very beginning. That privacy had protected me during the divorce and afterward. Ironically, it was now protecting me from my own parents' assumptions. As the afternoon passed, I considered calling Mom. I imagined asking why she wanted Liam to change my locks. I imagined hearing another explanation about safety or family. But something stopped me. If I confronted them too early, they might cancel whatever they were planning. Then I would never know how far they were actually willing to go. I didn't want guesses anymore. I wanted certainty. When my workday finally ended, I drove home more alert than usual. Every unfamiliar vehicle made me glance twice. Every sound outside my apartment caught my attention. Nothing appeared out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Standing inside my living room that evening, I looked at my front door for several long seconds. That ordinary lock suddenly represented something much bigger than security. It represented trust. If someone changed it without my permission, they wouldn't just be replacing hardware. They would be telling me that my choices no longer mattered. I took a slow breath, picked up my phone, and made a decision. I wasn't going to wait and hope for the best. I quietly excused myself from the table, stepped into the hallway, and called the building's security company. I asked them to review every camera before midnight and email me anything unusual. Then I returned smiling, cut my birthday cake, and waited to see whether my parents would actually go through with their plan. The rest of my birthday dinner passed in a blur, but my smile never slipped. I laughed when everyone sang happy birthday, thanked my relatives for the gifts, and even posed for a few family photos. On the outside, I looked completely relaxed. Inside, I couldn't stop thinking about my mother's whisper. Every time Dad glanced at Liam, I wondered if they were silently discussing the plan right in front of me. Mom carefully cut the birthday cake and placed the first slice on my plate. "Make a wish," she said with a warm smile. "I already did," I replied. She smiled back, never realizing my wish had nothing to do with birthdays anymore. I simply wanted to know the truth. As everyone became distracted by dessert and conversation, I noticed my opportunity. "I'll be right back," I said casually. "I need to make a quick phone call." Nobody questioned me. Dad was telling one of his old stories. Liam was teasing one of our cousins. Mom was pouring coffee. I quietly slipped away from the table and walked down the hallway toward the restaurant entrance. The hallway was almost empty. Soft music played through hidden speakers while employees carried trays toward the dining room. I stepped outside for a moment, took a slow breath, and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady. If my parents intended to interfere with my home, I wanted facts instead of assumptions. I searched for the number I needed and pressed call. A representative from the building security company answered after a few rings. "Good evening. How can I help you?" "Hi," I said calmly. "My name is Natalie Brooks. I need a favor regarding my property." Of course. I explained that I wanted all exterior and hallway cameras closely monitored over the next 24 hours. If anyone approaches my apartment door with tools or attempts to change the locks, I need the footage preserved immediately. The representative didn't sound surprised. "We can absolutely do that. I'd also like copies emailed to me as soon as possible." "Consider it done." I thanked him before ending the call. For a moment, I remained standing outside the restaurant. The cool evening air helped clear my thoughts. Part of me still hoped nothing would happen. Maybe my parents would change their minds. Maybe Liam would refuse. Maybe I had worried for nothing. But another part of me knew that if I ignored what I'd heard, I would always wonder how close they came to crossing the line. I walked back inside, with the same calm expression I had worn all evening. Nobody asked where I had been. Dad simply smiled. "There she is. We were about to eat your cake without you." "I wouldn't let that happen," I joked. Everyone laughed. The conversation drifted toward family vacations, work schedules, and upcoming holidays. I listened politely, but my attention stayed on the small details. Dad checked his watch twice. Mom quietly looked toward Liam several times. Liam seemed completely relaxed, unaware that I had overheard anything. Watching them made me realize something painful. Whatever they were planning, they believed they were doing the right thing. That didn't excuse it, but it explained why none of them looked nervous. They weren't acting like people preparing to betray me. They were acting like people convinced they knew what was best for my life. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. When dinner finally ended, everyone hugged goodbye in the parking lot. Mom kissed my cheek. "Drive home safely." "I will." Dad smiled. "We'll talk soon." "I'm sure we will." Liam waved as he climbed into his truck. "Happy birthday again, Nat." "Thanks." I watched their vehicles disappear into the night before walking to my own car. For the first time in years, I wasn't wondering whether my parents trusted me. I already knew the answer. The only question left was whether they would actually carry out their plan. The next evening, security footage showed Liam arriving with new locks and a toolbox, while my parents waited in Dad's truck across the street. Before he touched the door, the property manager walked over and asked one simple question that made Liam freeze. "Can I help you with this owner's building?" The following evening, I stayed at work a little later than usual, but my mind wasn't on emails or meetings. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing at my phone, wondering whether the security company had noticed anything. I kept reminding myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe my parents had changed their minds overnight. Maybe Liam had refused to get involved. I wanted to believe that. Just after 5 o'clock, my phone buzzed. An email notification appeared from the building's security company. The subject line simply read, "Camera alert." I took a slow breath before opening it. Attached were several still images captured only minutes earlier. The first picture showed Liam walking across the parking lot. He wasn't carrying groceries. He wasn't stopping by for a visit. In one hand, he held a metal toolbox. In the other, a brand new package containing replacement locks. My stomach tightened. The second image made everything even clearer. Across the street, parked where they had a full view of my building, sat Dad's pickup truck. Mom occupied the passenger seat. Neither of them got out. They simply waited. I stared at the pictures for several seconds. Part of me hoped there would still be an explanation. Maybe Liam planned to repair something else. Maybe the locks weren't for my apartment. Then another notification arrived. This time it was a short video clip. I pressed play. Liam walked confidently toward my front door. He looked around the hallway once before setting the toolbox on the floor. He reached inside and removed a screwdriver. There was no misunderstanding anymore. He fully intended to replace my locks. I felt disappointed more than angry. My parents hadn't simply talked about controlling my life. They had acted on it. Before I could decide what to do next, another video appeared. A familiar figure stepped into the hallway. It was the property's on-site manager. He approached Liam with a polite smile. "Good afternoon," he said. "Can I help you with something?" Liam looked surprised but stayed calm. "I'm just changing the locks." The manager glanced at the toolbox. "Are you the tenant?" Liam hesitated. "No." "The owner's brother." The manager looked puzzled. "I'm sorry?" "My sister lives here." The manager nodded politely. "I understand." Then he asked the question that instantly changed everything. "Can I help you with this owner's building?" Liam froze. For a moment, he simply stared. What?" "The owner," the manager repeated. "This building belongs to your sister's company." Liam blinked several times. "I think you've got the wrong person." The manager remained professional. "No, I don't." He checked something on his tablet before continuing. "The ownership records are very clear." Liam slowly lowered the screwdriver. His confident expression disappeared. He looked back toward the parking lot where Dad's truck remained parked across the street. Even through the camera, I could tell he was completely confused. He pulled out his phone with shaky hands. A few seconds later, another camera angle showed Dad answering his call inside the truck. Although I couldn't hear their conversation, I could read Liam's lips. "Dad." He pointed toward the manager, then toward the building. His face showed complete disbelief. The manager calmly waited beside him without raising his voice or creating a scene. He simply stood there, allowing Liam time to process what he had just learned. From the truck, I saw Dad step out and begin walking quickly toward the entrance. Mom followed only a few steps behind. Neither of them looked confident anymore. They looked worried. Everything they believed about my apartment had just collapsed. Liam looked completely confused when the manager addressed me as the property's owner over the phone. My brother called Dad in a panic, and I listened quietly as my father insisted there had to be some mistake. Seconds later, the manager emailed them a copy of the ownership records, and the silence on the call said everything. I watched the live security updates from my office with a mixture of disbelief and sadness. Everything I had feared was unfolding exactly as I had imagined. Liam still stood outside my apartment door with the unopened package of replacement locks in one hand, while the property manager remained calm and professional beside him. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was raising their voice. The truth alone had brought everything to a complete stop. My phone rang. It was the property manager. "Ms. Brooks," he said politely. "I wanted to make you aware that someone attempted to replace the lock on your apartment." "I've been watching the cameras," I replied. "Thank you for stepping in." "Of course," he answered. "I asked a few questions before allowing anyone to touch the door." "I appreciate that." He glanced toward Liam before speaking again. "I also informed him that your company owns this building." I figured that surprised him. You could say that. Even through the phone, I could hear the confusion in his voice. He honestly looked like he had no idea. "I don't think he did." The manager nodded. "I've asked everyone to remain where they are until we clear up the misunderstanding." "I'll handle it," I assured him. Before ending the call, he said something that stayed with me. "Your property is secure. Nothing has been changed." Relief washed over me. At least they hadn't crossed that final line. A moment later, another camera notification appeared. Dad had reached Liam and immediately started asking questions. Although the cameras couldn't capture every word clearly, it was obvious Dad believed the manager had made a mistake. I watched him point toward my apartment several times. Then he shook his head repeatedly. The manager remained patient. He opened his tablet and calmly explained the ownership records. Dad crossed his arms. "There has to be some mistake," he said. The manager didn't argue. Instead, he simply opened the county property records already linked through the management system. "You can verify everything yourself," he replied. "The ownership is registered to Brooks Property Holdings, LLC. Dad frowned. "I've never heard of that company." The manager looked at him politely. "The registered owner is Natalie Brooks." For several seconds, nobody moved. Mom looked from the tablet to my apartment door, then back to Dad. Her expression slowly changed from confidence to disbelief. Liam quietly lowered the toolbox to the ground. He looked embarrassed more than anything else. "I thought," he began. Then he stopped. Because there was nothing left to say. The manager offered another suggestion. "If you'd like, I can email copies of the ownership information that's publicly available." Dad nodded almost automatically. "Please." Within seconds, the email was sent. I watched as Dad checked his phone. He opened the documents one page at a time. The LLC registration, the property ownership records, the management authorization listing me as the sole owner. Every page confirmed exactly what he never imagined. Mom leaned closer to read over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them lasted much longer than any argument could have. Liam looked down at the unopened box of locks. "I can't believe this," he whispered. The property manager smiled kindly. Sometimes families simply don't know everything about each other. No one disagreed. The assumptions that had guided my parents for 2 years disappeared in a matter of minutes. They had believed I needed someone to rescue me. Instead, they had unknowingly tried to take control of property that legally belonged to me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt disappointed. More than anything, I wished they had trusted me enough to ask questions instead of making plans behind my back. Less than an hour later, my phone rang again. This time I already knew who it would be. My parents came to my apartment demanding an explanation. I calmly showed them the closing documents, mortgage records, and business filings. Mom burst into tears, admitting she thought controlling my home was the only way to protect me after my divorce. I finally understood how deeply they had crossed the line. About an hour after the property manager stopped Liam, my apartment doorbell rang. I had already guessed who was standing outside. When I looked through the peephole, I saw my parents in the hallway. Liam stood a few feet behind them, holding the unopened box of replacement locks and looking more uncomfortable than I had ever seen him. Nobody looked angry. They looked shaken. I unlocked the door, but left it only halfway open. Dad cleared his throat. "Nat, can we please talk?" His voice carried none of the certainty it had the night before at my birthday dinner. I studied their faces for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." The three of them entered quietly. The apartment was unusually silent. No one admired the decorations. No one commented on how clean everything looked. Instead, they slowly looked around as if they had walked into someone else's home. Liam gently placed the toolbox and the new locks beside the entrance. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I should have called you first." I looked at him. "Did you know whose apartment this really was?" He shook his head. "No. I honestly believed Mom and Dad when they said they were helping you." "I know." His shoulders relaxed slightly, grateful I wasn't blaming him alone. Dad stood near the living room window, still holding his phone with the ownership records open on the screen. "I've read these documents 3 times, he said quietly. "I still don't understand." "You will." I walked into my home office and returned carrying a black document case. It had stayed locked in my desk since the day I purchased the building. I placed it carefully on the coffee table. This answers every question. I opened the case and laid out the documents one by one: the purchase agreement, the closing statement, the mortgage paperwork, the LLC registration, property tax records, insurance documents, management agreements. Everything was organized by date. Everything carried my signature. Mom slowly sat down on the couch. She stared at the paperwork without speaking. Dad picked up the purchase agreement first. His eyes stopped on the closing date. "You bought this." He looked at me in disbelief. "Only 4 months after your divorce?" "Yes." He turned another page. "You never told us. You never asked." He looked surprised by my answer. "We thought—" "I know what you thought." Mom quietly spoke. "We believed you were renting." "I know." She looked confused. "Why didn't you correct us?" I answered honestly. "Because every time I tried sharing something important, it turned into advice about what I should do differently." I got tired of defending my own decisions. Nobody interrupted. I continued. "So I decided one part of my life would stay private." Dad slowly flipped through more paperwork. His expression changed with every page. "You own the entire building?" "I wasn't trying to control you. I thought I was protecting you." I gently shook my head. "When someone keeps making decisions for you without asking, it doesn't feel like protection. It feels like they don't trust you." The words hit her hard. She covered her face as she quietly cried. Dad looked around the apartment once more. The apartment felt unusually quiet after my parents walked out. I stood near the front door for several seconds, listening to the sound of their footsteps disappear down the hallway. Part of me wanted to run after them, but another part knew the conversation had ended exactly where it needed to. We had finally spoken honestly, and there was nothing left to pretend. I locked the door and leaned against it for a moment. My emotions were tangled. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't angry. Mostly, I felt exhausted. For years, I had worked to build a life where I could make my own decisions. I never imagined I would have to defend that independence to the people who were supposed to encourage it. I walked into the living room and looked at the documents still spread across the coffee table. The purchase agreement, the mortgage papers, the LLC registration. They weren't just legal records anymore. They represented every late night, every careful financial decision, and every sacrifice that had allowed me to rebuild after my divorce. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Liam. "I'm really sorry, Nat. I should have asked you before I agreed to anything." I smiled sadly. None of this had started with him. He had trusted our parents, just as he always had. I replied a few moments later. "I know you meant well. Just promise me something." A few seconds passed. "What?" "If anyone ever asks you to make decisions about my life again, ask me first." His answer came almost immediately. "I promise." That simple message gave me more peace than I expected. At least one important lesson had already been learned. I picked up the unopened package of replacement locks Liam had forgotten beside the door. For a moment, I stared at the box. It could have become the symbol of losing my independence. Instead, it became a reminder that boundaries matter, even with family. I placed the box inside a storage closet before opening the security app on my phone. The property manager had already restored everything to normal. Still, I wanted one final step that belonged to me. I opened the building's access settings. One by one, I removed every temporary guest code that had ever been shared. Old maintenance codes, delivery access, emergency visitor entries. Then I generated completely new access credentials. Nobody besides me and the authorized management team would have access going forward. When I finished, I quietly set my phone on the kitchen counter. A strange sense of calm settled over me. The apartment felt safe again. Not because of stronger locks, because my boundaries were finally clear. The next morning, I received a voicemail from Dad. He didn't ask me to call back immediately. He didn't try to explain himself again. Instead, he simply said, "Take all the time you need. I understand why you're hurt. I hope someday we can earn back your trust." I listened to the message twice. His words sounded sincere. But sincerity alone couldn't erase years of being treated like I wasn't capable of running my own life. Trust isn't rebuilt with one apology. It's rebuilt through consistent respect. Over the following days, my parents didn't stop by unexpectedly. They didn't ask neighbors questions. They didn't call repeatedly. For the first time in years, they gave me something they had never fully given me before. Space. As difficult as everything had been, I hoped they were beginning to understand what I had tried to explain that evening. Love and control are not the same thing. Real support begins with respect. Over the next several months, my parents stopped showing up unannounced and finally respected the boundaries I had set. Liam apologized separately, admitting he should have questioned their request instead of blindly following it. For the first time, our conversations were based on honesty instead of control. The weeks after that difficult evening passed more quietly than I expected. I kept waiting for my parents to fall back into their old habits, but something had genuinely changed. My phone no longer filled with constant questions about where I was or what I was doing. If they wanted to visit, they asked first. If I said I was busy, they simply replied, "Okay, maybe another time." At first, I wasn't sure whether the change would last. I had seen temporary improvements before, but this time felt different. Dad stopped offering opinions unless I asked for them. Mom resisted the urge to solve problems I never asked her to solve. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. One Saturday morning, I received another message from Liam. "Coffee this afternoon," I smiled. "Sure." We met at a small coffee shop a few miles from my apartment. The atmosphere felt relaxed, but I could tell he was nervous. He stirred his coffee for almost a minute before finally speaking. "I've been thinking about what happened." I nodded. "So have I." He looked embarrassed. "I should have questioned Mom and Dad." "You trusted them." "I know, but that's not an excuse." He looked down at the table. "I never stopped to ask whether you even wanted my help." His honesty caught me by surprise. "I appreciate you saying that." He let out a slow breath. "When the property manager said you owned the building, I felt like an idiot." I smiled gently. "It wasn't about the building." He looked confused. "What do you mean?" "It was about trust. If you'd called me first, none of it would have happened." He nodded immediately. "You're right." He paused before continuing. "I've always assumed Mom and Dad knew what was best." "So did I admitted. "But sometimes people can love you and still make the wrong decisions." He quietly absorbed those words. When we finished our coffee, he stood and gave me a quick hug. "I'm proud of you, Nat. Not because you own a building, because you stood up for yourself." Those words meant more than he probably realized. As the months passed, family gatherings slowly became easier. The first holiday dinner after everything happened felt awkward at first. Everyone seemed careful with their words. Nobody mentioned the apartment. Nobody joked about my life. Instead, conversations stayed simple. Work, travel, favorite recipes, ordinary things. Halfway through dinner, Mom looked at me. "We're thinking about coming into the city next month." She paused. "Would it be okay if we visited?" The question seemed small, but to me, it meant everything. They were asking, not assuming, not announcing. Asking. I smiled. "Yes, I'd like that." Dad quietly nodded. "Thank you." Those two words carried more respect than years of advice ever had. Little by little, our relationship began rebuilding itself. Not because we ignored the past, because we finally learned from it. My parents discovered that supporting an adult daughter meant trusting her judgment. I learned that forgiveness didn't require pretending nothing had happened. It required giving people the opportunity to become better than they had been before. Looking back, I realized the apartment had never been the real issue. The locks had never been the real issue. The The real issue was whether my family could respect the life I had built without trying to control it. Thankfully, they finally could. Today, my birthday reminds me of more than cake or presents. It reminds me that healthy families protect each other without taking away each other's independence. The apartment they tried to lock me out of became the place where I finally unlocked the confidence to live life on my own terms. A year has passed since the birthday dinner that changed everything. Every time my birthday comes around, I think about that quiet whisper I was never supposed to hear. Funny enough, I don't remember the cake or the presents anymore. I remember the moment I realized that even people who love you can cross a line if they stop respecting your independence. Life looks very different now. My relationship with my parents isn't perfect, but it's honest. They call before visiting. They ask instead of assuming. When I tell them I've already handled something, they simply smile and say, "We're proud of you." Those words still surprise me. Dad has changed in ways I never expected. Instead of checking whether my smoke detectors work or asking if my landlord has fixed something, he asks how my investment projects are going. The first time he did that, I almost laughed. "There isn't a landlord, remember?" I teased. He smiled sheepishly. "I know. I guess I'm still getting used to thinking of you as the owner. It suits you." That simple sentence meant more than he probably realized. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at me as someone who needed guidance. He was looking at me as an equal. Mom changed too. She still worries because that's simply who she is. But now she asks permission before offering advice. Sometimes she'll stop herself halfway through a sentence. "I was about to tell you what I think you should do." Then she'll smile. "But you didn't ask." We both laugh. It's a small habit, but it reminds me how hard she's worked to respect the boundaries we talked about. Liam and I became closer than we had been in years. Every now and then, he jokes about the unopened box of replacement locks. "I still can't believe I carried those things all the way to your apartment." Neither of us laughs because it was funny. We laugh because we both know how differently that day could have ended. The unopened package still sits on a shelf inside my storage closet. I never threw it away. Not because I'm holding on to anger, because it reminds me of an important lesson. Strong locks protect a home. Healthy boundaries protect relationships. One afternoon, my parents visited for coffee. As they were getting ready to leave, Dad stopped at the front door. He looked at the lock for a second before turning toward me. "I'm glad we never changed it." I smiled. "So am I." Then he added something I will never forget. "We almost locked ourselves out of your life." The hallway became completely quiet. He wasn't talking about the apartment anymore. He was talking about our family. I walked over and hugged him. Mom joined us a second later. No one cried. No dramatic speeches followed. Sometimes healing doesn't happen through grand moments. Sometimes it happens through simple understanding. As I closed the door after they left, I looked around the apartment that had become so much more than a place to live. It was where I rebuilt my confidence after my divorce. It was where I learned to trust my own decisions. It was where my parents finally learned that supporting someone doesn't mean controlling them. Today, my birthday means something completely different to me. It isn't about getting older. It isn't about candles or gifts. It's a reminder that real love gives people room to grow instead of holding them back. The apartment they once tried to lock me out of became the place where I finally unlocked the confidence to live life on my own terms, and that turned out to be the greatest gift I ever gave myself.